Hello everybody and welcome back for another video. How am I looking? Alright, so today I'm going to cover a game that I played against a subscriber on the YouTube channel named Frank. It was actually just a very standard kind of boring game, and that's actually the reason I want to show it, is because I've realized that a lot of games kind of end because a player self-destructs. And I've seen that in tournament games, especially blitz games, but I realize it's kind of a psychological tendency to, when nothing's really going on in the game, to try to spice it up. But actually that can be the wrong decision in a lot of games. Now, I've been working on my outline for my course that I'm going to start filming next week. Hopefully I can start getting it out next week, but no promises there. But I really, I've just been taking time away from the channel and away from kind of just the mill of looking at games and trying to do topical stuff, because I really want to make content that kind of stands the test of time and goes very deep, but also provides a lot of simple value. I don't really want to make content that is just, of course there's a place for that, just topical, even like this video. But I really have been trying to go into my own brain and think about the mechanics, and explain it to people who watch my videos. Try to get some deeper understanding than a chess book would give you, because I was reading this book too, Soviet Middle Game Technique, which is a pretty good book, but there's a lot of kind of just information that's thrown at you as if you're supposed to absorb it all, and it takes a lot of time to absorb information, and my goal is to make things as simple as possible. So alright, with that said, let's jump into the game. So d4, I'm black, and we see kind of just a standard d4 opening with these moves here. And I want to make a point that in this opening, basically we're not calculating anything. There's just an understanding plus analysis. And that's actually what the course is going to be about. It's going to be about understanding plus analysis. And we're going to go into how that feeds into your thought process and what it really means. So when you're in the opening, you're basically relying on your understanding, because there's really not much contact between the pieces. So you basically just play what you understand. And we see here, basically white goes back because he either wants to solidify this bishop, not get the weak pawn on f4, although there are some benefits for that because it gives strong control of e5. But, it's not a bad move. So I castle, again, understanding. There's no calculation here at this point. Develops, bishop develops, and now white decides to play knight to e5 to prevent me from playing e5 myself. Not a bad move. Castles was another option too. Alright, so at this point we see that white has played knight to e5 and there's a little more contact. Not much, but my understanding is leading me to basically try to get rid of this knight. And the way I do that, now I can either take it, not here because that would be a fork, but the bishop. But I don't want this pawn to chase back my knight on f6. So instead, I decide to play knight to e4 and then play f6, chasing the knight back. Now, a lot of players might not play that because they think, if the bishop takes, then you have a weak pawn. Now, the most important thing in chess, as I'm always talking about, is piece activity. Because that determines, how many squares you control on the board. So if you're worrying about a weak pawn, which only controls 2 squares, but you're not worrying about the knight that's on your territory and your inactive knight that's sitting on f6 for now, then you need to check your priorities, and that really influences your understanding and your move choice. Okay, so basically white didn't take that knight, and I wouldn't be worried if it did, because I can always play f5 to defend the pawn and have a strong center. But now I'm able to play f6 after he plays f4. And notice that if white chases my own knight, I can even just take here. It gives the rook an open file, but after g6, then actually this king side, these pawns, after I take here even, take on e5 with a weak pawn, then actually I'd have an advantage because I'm going to develop much quicker. White has either a weak king side or a weak queen side, because I can just rush these pawns and hit b4 quicker. All right, we don't see that. Instead, we see f4, and then I play f6. All right, so white tries to play actively, not a bad idea. And now I can take here. I could have played g6, but I just decided to play simply, take it, and now I have to do some calculation. All right, so basically this bishop is trapped, and I have two moves, really, well, three moves. So I can play bishop to b4 and try to complicate things. I can either play something like knight to f6 and hit the queen, and now if he takes, then that's okay too. Or I could just take on e5. So I really had to calculate bishop to b4 because that was the most attractive option to me. Because if he takes, then obviously that's pretty bad for white, because after I take, then I have an attack. Instead, well, actually bishop to b4 though, he doesn't have to take, so I calculated bishop takes, and then after I take, he could play here. So you always have to look for the checks, captures, and threats, and this isn't necessarily something that you can solve, by solving a million tactical puzzles. You just have to have that as a habit in your thinking. And so once I saw this line of bishop threatening the queen, there's no way to defend here, and actually after I take, he takes, then it's actually a pretty bad position for black. So I didn't play that. I just simply took and weakened his pawns and then hit the bishop, bolstering this knight on e4 as well as getting a tempo on this bishop. He goes back, and then I just resume my development. And now actually I have a minus 1.7 advantage at this point in the game. All right, so actually if you want to pause here and try to guess the best move, I actually missed it. Because my main plan with bishop here was to play bishop to b5, and I was so connected to that plan that I didn't see the other option. Now the other option here is bishop to e8, hitting the queen, and then bishop to g6, which actually is a perfect placement for the bishop as opposed to b5, and actually I can get the rook out and attack this e5 pawn pretty well. So instead I just play g6, and I could have played g5 hitting the queen after he played queen to h4, and then played bishop to e8 and bring it in. But instead I just decided to simplify. Alright, so some inaccuracies there, because I was basically obsessed with my bishop to b5 plan. And again, so I would have understood to play that move based on my understanding, but I just followed the wrong plan. So you also need to be aware of getting too attached to your plan, and you need to be basically adaptable at all times in order to not make those kind of mistakes. All right, so I decided to just trade down, and it's basically totally equal at this point in the game. Although I'd say white has a slightly better advantage because of his more centralized king, and there's some weak pawns. Now, white really should have played something like bishop to f6. Instead, he decides to trade, and I get in bishop to b5. It's totally equal at this point. He probably should have brought the rook out. Let me turn that off. All right, so he probably should have brought the rook out. Again, piece activity. He could have played bishop to f6, being active and controlling squares. But instead, we see white kind of self-destruct. Now, this is what I was talking about, is that when your opponent, when it's an equal position, it's kind of easy to self-destruct because you start seeing phantoms, I guess you would say. And that happens to all players at all levels. I've heard grandmasters talking about how they saw a phantom. And that's kind of what happens at this point in the game. So basically, I follow a very simple strategy. I knew that black was controlling d8, so my plan was to play rook to f7 and then get on to the d file, because I didn't see any future from my rook on here, and the bishop was controlling this important square. So white could have brought his rook out, played something like b3, tried to get my bishop out, but we both have options to bring the bishop in to protect the pawn. He could have played bishop to f6, and it would have been equal. Although I will say that if you don't play very actively in equal bishop endings, people will say that they're just drawn. I've lost quite a few equal bishop endings when you just play passively, so you really have to watch out for that. All right, so let's see what happens. So some passive play. Now you always want to question, in your mind, if you see a move back that you're going to make, you want to really ask yourself, why am I making a move back? Do I really need to make this move? Because a move back reduces your piece activity, and in the end game, the king is a piece that you can use to fight against your opponent. So removing the king back, not only reducing your king's activity, but also reducing the rook's activity. So keep that in mind. All right, so I bring my rook in, and again, another piece back, reducing his control of the dark squares. And now we see total self-destruction with pawn up. So the best move probably would have been something like bishop to f4, and then try to bring in the pawns, or even just move the king, although maybe not there because now he has some trouble with the check. But at least he should have tried to activate with these pawns and keep his rook and bishop active. Notice that all of his pieces are suddenly quarantined off into this little rectangle here, and I'm just about to invade his position. All right, so he gives me a free pawn, and at this point I knew the game was kind of over because my rook's going to infiltrate, and I can even trade and probably win with an extra pawn by rushing the pawn down the queen side and then just going over here and taking these weak pawns. So instead I decided to just keep my pieces, probably give me more options to win. You have to be careful, of course. Sometimes when there's an equal bishop ending, you have to be careful about being a pawn up and trading down because there's a lot more drawing opportunities. So I check and then pick up another pawn. Now I thought he would come in something like here, but instead he plays a little bit passively, trying to give some exit squares to his king. So instead of counterattacking, he just basically tries to infiltrate in the wrong way. And now, at this point, I can just push my pawns. But instead I go for a trade, being 2 pawns up. And we'll just play through the rest of this game here. Made some pawn move mistakes, allowing me to capture 1 more pawn. So never put your pawns on the color of your opponent's bishop in an opposite color endgame, because that'll really bite you in the butt. Because basically you can your opponent can just capture any pawns as soon as your king's not defending him, and you just drop a ton of pawns and lose. Alright, so he played to the bitter end. We'll just go through these moves quick. And checkmate. Alright, so those moves are really not that important. But what is important is that moment when he's self-destructed. So that's the moment that you want to look at your decision process. After two pawns down, there's really nothing you can do. He could bring his king over, but then I would just get over here and win these pawns. So, all right, so let's keep going back. All right, so this is the critical moment, really, of why didn't he get a draw. It's basically because of these 3 moves. Back, back, and then giving away a pawn. Those are the losing moves. So we need to focus on improving our understanding plus our analysis. And your understanding in a game, now let's go down to the graph. Let me go down here, and we can see how it progressed. So it was totally equal. I got an advantage that I squandered away because I didn't bring the bishop to g6. He got a slight advantage once I traded down to a bishop of opposite color endgame, and then he self-destructed in about 3 moves. And then he just kept dropping pawns. So really, that's how you should be analyzing these type of games. You don't want to you want to find the critical moments that you missed, and then you want to correct your thinking, your understanding, and say, why didn't I apply my understanding? And what analysis errors did I make? All right, so I repeat myself a lot on this channel. I feel like But actually, that's kind of the process of learning chess. Is you play games over and over, and you learn how to get better at analysis and understanding. It's not necessarily an information overload. It's kind of a repetition of the basics until they are very strictly followed. All right, so hopefully this video wasn't too rambling on, but I feel like I got all the points out that I wanted to make. And keep an eye out for that course. Leave some questions. If I need more questions for my podcast to answer, because it's kind of a listener-driven podcast, I would say. Also, I got the podcast on Anchor.fm, which should be spread out, from my understanding, to other places like Spotify and iTunes. So just visit the link below, and I'll see you in the future. Thanks for watching. Bye.